John Cleese is still in trouble, days after the fact that he tweeted that London was no longer an English city, which it isn't, because it's not majority English, which is how we determine what is and is not an English city. This is an opinion piece in The Guardian, and you know that an opinion piece in The Guardian is going to end up being very, very good reading, by Maya Goodfellow, a woman who I can't help but notice is not white, and she now wants to talk about whiteness. So this will be an interesting conversation that we're going to have with her. John Cleese isn't alone in equating English with white. Sadly, that view is mainstream. Now I have to have a conversation about race with The Guardian. Why? Why is it always The Guardian? Why is it always The Guardian that's obsessed with race? But okay, fine. Is it any wonder that being English is generally associated with being white? Given how the English are a northern European people. The Anglo-Saxons came from northwest Germany. They migrated across in the sort of 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, formed the English kingdoms, the Septuarchy, I think it's pronounced, and then there were various intermixing with the Celts. There were the invasions from the Danes and the Norwegians. England ends up being the confluence of a collection of northern European peoples, of different tribes. All of these people had very white skin. And so by about, I think it's about the 9th century, 10th century, when the phrase, the identity of English really starts coming into being, it's no surprise that this is coming into being about white-skinned people. Now, I don't really care about that. This is not something I actually give a shit about. It just seems to be a historical fact. And then in the 11th century, where the Normans invade, they were also a white-skinned people. So the tone of the skin of the English hasn't really changed all that much in the last 1,000 years. And so we end up in the modern day, where we have an immigrant from presumably non-white part of the world, given how she's not white, saying, I can't believe being English is associated with whiteness. What the fuck do you want us to do about it? It's not really any kind of surprise that most people view the English as being white because they appear to be white, at least racially, through their skin colour. But luckily for everyone else, being English is not just about being a race. Being English is also about a collection of values and a worldview, a particularly individualistic worldview, a kind of unique worldview, in fact. I've yet to find another culture that shares a worldview like it. And so it's very unique and a very special thing. And there are many, many people who are not white, who are foreign, who come to the country because they like the way the country manages itself. They like the English view of the world. And I know because I'm the descendant of one of them. My grandfather came from St. Helena, an island off the coast of Africa. He came here because he loved England. He loved the way the English did things. He loved cricket. He loved just the I can't show you any of the grounds here because I'm in Italy at the moment, but he loved the countryside. He loved the way of life that the English had, and he went out of his way to integrate himself into it. He wanted to become an Englishman, making my father an Englishman, making myself an Englishman. This is one of those things where it's about a commitment to a set of ideals as much as it is interest in racial politics. And it shows the remarkable tolerance of the English way of life that someone from a foreign land can come here with a love of the country and integrate themselves into it, even with people being racist, even with these kind of barriers. They can be overcome and have been overcome. And so when you sit there saying, well, being English is about being white, well, only because most English people are white. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people in England who are not white who consider themselves English. I'm sure that many of the Windrush generation totally consider themselves English because they've come to England to join the English way of life. They want to think like English people. They want to be like English people. People used to look up to us. People used to respect us and admire us and want to emulate us. And in my opinion, good for them. I think that being an Englishman is something that should be exported from England. It's a particular way of viewing the world as much as anything else. And it's one of those great things that England gave to the world. An individualistic outlook on the world. saying, look, I as a human being have value. I matter. Every human matters. There is not just some subsection of society that has no value. No untouchables in English society, or at least in principle. There, of course, always are. But at least in principle, that's understood to be wrong. But anyway, Maya, let's get back to racial politics. Let's not talk about values or ideas or ideals or things that actually make the world a better place. Let's get back to your fucking racial politics. So she quotes John Cleese and then begins, where to start? Maybe with the most obvious point of them all. Cleese is fine with immigration if it's him moving. It's plausible that when he sat down to write this tweet, Cleese was in Nevis in the Caribbean. Having had enough of the England he cherishes so much, he announced last year that he was planning to move there. The difference is obvious. He bemoans immigrants in London, but because of race and class, he is called an expat in the Caribbean. Maya, immigrants are not just a race. There are many hundreds of thousands of immigrants from France. And if you go to London, into an area that is predominantly populated by French people, it would not be sensible to say, well, this is an English area of London, is it? And yet that's nothing to do with their race, because they, like you will obviously point out, are white. So it's not about race, it's about culture, which is what John Cleese himself said. He is a culturalist. And yes, he moved to Nevis in the Caribbean. Now, I think that he would probably agree that a small number of immigrants is perfectly tolerable, maybe even desirable. But a large number of immigrants, to the point where the capital city of the United Kingdom is now not an English city, is perhaps taking that principle too far. And I'm sure that the people in Nevis, when he comes there, think, well, that's fine, a few immigrants is okay. But if it were to be a flood of immigrants, to the point where they become a minority in their own city, maybe they would think, well, that's too far. And because of race and class, he's called an expat. Well, I'm sure that people from the native countries from which these immigrants have come do not call the people who have left immigrants. Why would they not call themselves expats? Now, Cleese claimed these comments were not about race, but back in Australia, he gave more evidence for his argument. I had a Californian friend come over 2 months ago, walk down King's Road with me and say, well, where are all the English people? Assuming they didn't ask every single person they saw that day where they were born, how did Cleese's Californian friend know none of them were English? Maybe he heard them speak. Maybe he saw the shop signs in Arabic. Maybe he saw the burqas and abayas and the thobes and thought, this doesn't seem very culturally English to me. If these gentlemen from other places in the world had been walking down the street in suits and waistcoats, in floral dresses, with bonnets or something like that, maybe he would have said, well, these people do seem to be culturally English, even if they're not racially English. They would have seemed to have, at least in some way, acclimatized to the environment and become part of the natural landscape of the English culture. But that doesn't seem to be the case. I know because I walk through London, and I know these people aren't English either. They certainly don't identify as being English, do they? They obviously identify as something else. They haven't looked at the culture and the mannerisms and the customs of the English and said, yes, I like that. I would like to be a part of that. I would like to join this culture and support it. Instead, they seem to be doing the opposite. They seem to be clinging to their own cultures and customs in the very heart of England. Why is that being allowed? They should want to change. Why are you coming to another country if you've got no interest in doing as the Romans do? Which is an English phrase, if you didn't know, Maya, which I'm sure you do. I'm sure you're well aware that we have an expectation that if people want to come here, they should want to come here to be like us, to follow our culture and customs, to be integrated into the wider scheme that is the tapestry of English life. If I were going to move to another country, I would pick one whose culture that I thought I might be able to integrate into. There was a program on TV the other day called Neighbours from Hell that I was watching with my wife. And it was about Spanish people who were harassing English people who'd moved to Spain. And it was because the English people who'd moved to Spain were doing nothing to integrate with local Spanish custom. They weren't learning the language. They weren't behaving like the Spanish do in their local areas. They were just acting like English people abroad. They were acting as if they'd colonized the place. And that's what foreign people who are coming to England and acting in their native ways are indeed doing as well. It's no wonder people aren't enjoying it, because they want their culture to be something they recognise. They want it to be familiar so they can feel safe in their own land. And if it's not familiar, they don't feel safe and they don't like it. And I think that's completely understandable. I think every culture is like this. You have to wonder what it means for London not to be English. What does it mean to be an English city? Cleese gave us the idea that in 2011, I love being down in Bath, he said, because it feels like the England I grew up in. Who knows why Cleese feels at home there? Is it because the overwhelming majority of the population of that city is white British? I mean, what do you expect, really? It looks like an English city. I've been to Bath many times. I feel very much like I'm in a very English place. It feels English, it acts English, people speak English, people dress like English people have English mannerisms and customs. I know what to expect when I go there. Why is it wrong that John Cleese feels the same way about the place when he doesn't feel that way about London? London doesn't feel English. It's a proud European global city, according to Sadiq Khan. Why would it not feel different? How could you expect it not to feel different? And why is that a bad thing? I thought you were for diversity. I thought you were for a plurality of cultures. Well, does English culture not have to exist somewhere? But as soon as we say that, well, it's all about race. It's race, race, race. Only in your mind. I don't think John Cleese thinks about race all that much at all. And then we get to Maya's apologetics. Oh, it's always been this way. What are you talking about? Nothing's changed. London and parts of Britain have always been diverse. Irish and Jewish immigrants in the 1800s and early 1900s were considered racialized others, people from colonies and former colonies who, after being educated in the English curriculum, came as citizens to work in the mother country were met with racism. This is perhaps not the England Cleese had in mind, but it's the England that has long been. There is no English history, the academic Stuart Hall wrote, without that other history. Yeah, no one's saying that. No one's saying that that hasn't been the case. No one's saying that there haven't been immigrants or an outside population that has lived in London. What they're saying is the borders have been opened and now the white English are the minority in London. And that's a true statement. And it hasn't always been this way. This is a new state of affairs. And one that you are apparently completely on board with, whether the native English like it or not. I mean, I would suggest that that was a form of colonialism. I would suggest that if the English did that to other people, you'd object. You'd have a major problem with that being done to other people around the world. You would say, whoa, 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 they're saying that this doesn't feel like, Nigeria anymore. This feels like a different country, the one that's been colonized by English people now. This is not right. This is wrong to displace them in their own homeland. But when it happens in London, when it happens to the English, you're okay with it. And when an Englishman objects to this, you call him a racist. The history and what it means for England's sense of self is ill understood. Cleese defended his comments by claiming it's legitimate to prefer one culture to another, but there is no such thing as one static culture tied to one particular nation. And he never said that there was. You are reframing his statement in order to fit your narrative, so you can knock down a straw man. He never said culture was static. He never said it was exclusively tied to one nation. He didn't say that there weren't fuzzy borders on these things, and they were immutable. But there is something called English culture, and that is something that should exist in England, is it not? You saying there's no such thing as a static culture is irrelevant. No one's claiming that. You're the only one putting those words into his mouth. You are deliberately misrepresenting him, so you don't have to address his core point, and that is that it is legitimate to prefer some cultures over others. You, Maya, do it yourself. You prefer other cultures to English culture. You are currently writing in defense of other cultures over English culture. So you agree with John Cleese. Again, there is no contradiction here. You are just misrepresenting him in order to be able to say, well, I disagree with my straw man of his comments, and therefore he's wrong. You are completely in agreement with him. You are just dishonest. But this is not just about Cleese, although he's an Oxbridge-educated, wealthy actor, is a reminder of just how disingenuous it is for politicians to claim that it's predominantly the white working class or the left behind that feel threatened by immigration. Again, that's not disingenuous at all. It is predominantly the white English working class that feel threatened by this, but that doesn't mean it's only the English working class who feel threatened by this. There is definitely a kind of cultural fabric that is being damaged by mass immigration. And even old Englishmen from like the 60s and 70s who grew up with a sense of confidence and pride in being English, possibly because they were the ones who fought against the Nazis and stood alone against them in the 40s or 1940. Perhaps that's something to do with it. Perhaps there is something there that was uniquely English that is being eroded. And I'm glad that it's not just the white English working classes that see this, because everyone can see it. It is something that's happening. It is the damage that mass immigration is doing to the social fabric of the country. The numbers are too great. It doesn't even matter where they come from. What matters is they're coming in the hundreds of thousands, and this is piling up into the millions. And the native population were never asked. They were never asked, is this something we want? If you had a referendum tomorrow on whether we should have more or less immigration, then you know it's going to come back in a landslide as less. This very idea that Cleese is so wedded to, that immigration is making London less English, has been, in different ways, reproduced through the UK's mainstream debate on immigration and race for decades, if not centuries. Only it's been applied to the country as a whole and not just to London. How could it be any other way when there is no impetus for foreigners who come here to integrate? How could it be any other way? How could it be that bringing in millions of people from other parts of the world and not requiring them to become like us would make the place less English? It's just logically incongruent to suggest that it would still be just as English if we had millions of non-English people. It just doesn't make sense. Why are you complaining about this? Why are you pointing this out? Like, what is your argument here, Maya? How could it be anything else? What would you expect it to be like? The idea that national identity needs to be guarded against culturally different others was part of the reason 11 Labour MPs protested against the Empire Windrush docking at Tilbury in 1948. It was connected to Theresa May's Home Office sending go-home vans around diverse parts of the country. It's what William Hague was referring to when he warned of the UK becoming a foreign land. It was also central to Tony Blair's New Labour fixation on Britishness, on Gordon Brown's British Jobs for British Workers pledge, and Ed Miliband's 2015 election offer of controls on immigration. The underlying sentiment of Cleese's comments is part of what politicians mean when they talk about listening and responding to people's legitimate concerns about immigration. Here, perceived culture remains intimately connected to race. I don't agree. I don't agree that there's necessarily a racial connection there, because you don't know what race you're talking about when you're talking about the culture of immigrants. I think it is legitimately connected to the way people behave. I mean, growing up for me, there were many black British people who I would naturally regard as Englishmen were I to meet them in a foreign country. I mean, if you ran into like John Barnes or Lenny Henry in sub-Saharan Africa, they're not going to have more in common with the Africans because of their skin colour than they are the other Englishmen they might meet on holiday. Like, they're not going to have that. They're going to know a lot more about the way that the white English think than the way the black Africans think because of their cultural upbringing. It's not necessarily tied to race. It is tied to likeness, to similarity in modes of thought and behaviour and comfort and familiarity. That's what people are looking for. It is not necessarily tied to race, Maya, but you are an absolute race hustler, and it must be, or else you have no point. Englishness and Britishness are, in all kinds of subtle ways, still tied to whiteness. The connection is there in the supremacist narratives of the British Empire that suggest innate capability meant a country such as England developed. It's nothing to do with innate capability. It's about hard work. It's because we did the graft. We suffered and made ourselves prosperous. That's why. It's not because of any kind of innate superiority. If anything, it's because of the conflict and the competition between nations that Europe spawned. I would suggest reading Guns, Germs and Steel for a more nuanced interpretation of this. I'm just going to give you the Cliff Notes version, but it's the particular environmental climate in Europe that created such competitive nations, and Britain being an island gave it a natural advantage, a natural defence against the other nations of Europe against which it could compete. It's detectable in the way certain immigrants and Britons, including people from Eastern Europe, who are seen as part of a degraded whiteness, are more likely than others to be imagined as a threat to British culture. It's painfully obvious when you compare compare how some people's Englishness is questioned, think Norman Tebbit's cricket test, while other people's is absolute. The problem is far bigger than one comment made by one actor. It's written into the way race, immigration, and nation are understood in popular debate, and that's what we need to change. Okay, Maya, I don't really know what you mean by degraded whiteness, and honestly, I don't really care. I think that you're a massive and disgusting race hustler, and I don't give a damn about your opinions on these things. Culture is not a direct expression of race. Otherwise, people would not be able to adopt new cultures. People who come from a different race to the one in which they were raised would not be culturally acclimatized to that race, and yet they are. So you can say, oh, culture's all about race if you want, but then you're just following the line of thought from the alt-right. Personally, I think culture is a lot more tied to environment. The surroundings in which you are raised, in my opinion, dictate your culture, and the culture itself is informed by the geography of the place in which you are. It's actually, in my opinion, a lot less about race and more about where you find yourself. But the fact that cultures exist is true, and the fact that these things are damaged by mass immigration is also true. So why are you trying to pretend like it's not?